Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar, Future Ready K-12, Reliable, Safe School Networks. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the Content Director for eSchool News, and I'm happy you are joining us today for what I know will be a very insightful and important conversation. This event is brought to you by the companies Ericsson and Carahsoft. Ericsson Enterprise Wireless Solutions provides secure and reliable wireless connectivity for business through private 5G networks, 5G coverage, and wireless WAN solutions. Their portfolio empowers organizations to operate, grow, and innovate without constraints across industries, businesses, and the public sector. Ericsson's wireless solutions empower educational institutions, particularly K-12 school districts, to extend classroom access beyond traditional walls, fostering reliable, secure, and manageable internet connectivity wherever learning happens. Carahsoft is a trusted government IT solutions provider, delivering software and support solutions to federal, state, local, and education customers. Carahsoft maintains dedicated teams, supports sales and marketing for all its vendors. Now, before we get to our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the features of the platform we're using here for the webinar. This event is being recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing anything. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. If you have a question or a comment for the panelists, there's a chat function at the bottom there that you can launch. Feel free to use this feature as well to contact someone from the eSchool News team if you have a technical question. But as we go through, I really encourage you to use that function, as it helps the panelists and myself drive this conversation. With that, with these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with the conversations and some introductions. Ben, maybe you can start us off. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Sure. Thank you. Great to be here. Name's Ben Mobies. I'm based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and I am one of the directors of our public sector business in the U.S. For Ericsson. You might have known some of our teams as Cradlepoint in the past. Cradlepoint is a product set inside of Ericsson. So just wanted to make sure if you hear different names, you'll understand which part of the big company which we live in. Been very involved in the world of both schools and K through 12, as well as data networking, really on the Wi-Fi and cellular side of this business for about 30 years now. So love helping schools build new connectivity methods to really support the overall goals that they have in educating their students. So like I said, very happy to be here, and hand it over to Jim Kerr for a quick intro.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm Jim Kerr, Principal Consultant and Chief Cook and Bottle Washer at KB and Associates. Our software as a service product is called E-Rate ProfitWorks. We work with service providers and manufacturers in supporting them through the E-Rate process, both compliance as well as marketing analytics, et cetera. And I've been at this for a number of years. I was actually sold in this industry many years ago, and then did end user consulting. Started working with E-Rate in 1998, year one. And in 2009, we formed KB and Associates. And my friends say I went back to the dark side and started working with the manufacturer and service provider side of the equation. So that's it.
Great. Well, thank you both for taking the time and sharing your insights today. Maybe we can kind of get started, and we can pick both your brains about the state of play of E-Rate. It's one of the great institutions within education technology, dating back to last century, and Al Gore inventing the internet, right? It was right around that time. But really, it really has been the infrastructure that has fueled all the other technologies that have blossomed that help students in K-12 school districts. Maybe talk a little bit about where we are these days and how districts can look at E-Rate and as it has evolved over the years.
So I'll field that one, starting with, so the news coming out of E-Rate has been Not good over the last few days, but generally good. In June of this year, June 27th to be exact, the Supreme Court ratified the constitutionality of Universal Service Fund. And that was huge because that was under attack. So the Universal Service Fund exists, E-rates exists underneath of that Universal Service Fund. It's one of the 4 items funded underneath of the Universal Service. And so that $5 billion allocation of funding for schools and libraries through the E-rate program is inviolate, which is the good news. Within that, they have flexibility through the FCC to play games with the eligibility of certain components. And there is a move afoot by the FCC chairman who wrote portions of the Project 2025 through his office, is now trying to negate the eligibility of the school bus Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi hotspots. I think there's a unique misunderstanding of what it means to provide SIPA compliance through these products, which is a requirement for delivery of any of these services. You can go back to the previous slide, Kevin. So that's what's happening right now. So we think that unfortunately, that school bus Wi-Fi will become ineligible under E-rate, but there are other avenues to obviously fund the capabilities that and the promises that the bus Wi-Fi brings to the table. But how do we get to this thing called E-rate in the first place? So in 1996, Congress passed the Telecommunications Act. Underneath of it, it created the Universal Service Fund, and it was within that to establish rules to enhance access to advanced telecommunications and information services for public and nonprofit elementary and secondary school classrooms and public libraries. Again, it's ratified and it is codified by the Supreme Court to be constitutional. So that's the good news. Next. So what happens with the E-rate program? It's funded by the Universal Service Access fees on your phone bill. This too is subject to change. Congress has a working group that is actually a bipartisan working group trying to do some contribution reform act to the Universal Service Fund because it has become outsized and is negatively impacting people that can least afford it on your phone bill. So every phone bill with subscriber line has what's called the Universal Service Fee on it. It fluctuates, but it can be as much as $1.50 a month. And that equates to the $8 billion annually for the Universal Service Fund. It's administered by the Universal Services Administrative Companies, Schools, and Libraries Division. So anytime you hear the words USAC or the term USAC, that's what we're referring to. Again, $5 billion available each year for K-12 and libraries for internet access and broadband delivery on the campus. And we're going into the 28th year. It's been a very successful program. As far as waste, fraud, and abuse goes these days, it has less than 0.25% over those many years of waste, fraud, and abuse that's been adjudicated. So there you go. It's been a pretty darn successful program and with a very low administrative rate associated with it. And next. So eligible schools and libraries apply each year for the program. Once you have certain elements of it, you don't have to go through the entire competitive bidding process to get to a form to file. If you sign a multi-year contract as an example, and those eligible schools and libraries can get a discount ranging from 20% to 90% on approved services. High end, and it's based on the National School Lunch Program poverty level. So the higher the poverty level of that particular applicant, the greater their discount.
Yeah, so why don't I jump in and just quickly talk about a good example of where we've used some of these funds to really help students, right, specifically. So we saw this a lot as some of the during COVID and immediate post-COVID problems that we faced. One of the most acute problems was bus driver shortages around the country. Many school systems were dealing with this problem. And it ended up having all sorts of impacts, one of which was because of the shortages, a lot of kids were having to take, they were combining multiple bus routes into one bus. So before you might have shorter bus routes and more buses because you had more drivers. When you lost the drivers, we ended up with routes that weren't that long in mileage, but that were often taking over an hour to get kids home. So you had very impacted from a standpoint of time for the students to be able to do homework. You're getting home later because your bus ride was longer. And one of the things that the FCC was trying to also do at the time was address the problem of kids not having broadband at home, right? So many of these kids were coming home to either no broadband access or maybe having to do other work and take care of other people inside of their homes. And so that route, that long bus route, was often their only time to actually get homework done. And so, so one of the things that we were doing, especially post-COVID, using first, there was some money that was available before E-rate supported this, and then E-rate took over. But simply putting Wi-Fi routers on buses, so connecting to cellular infrastructure, and then providing students a highly secured way of getting to the internet, usually back to their school resources. That's where, whether it was cloud-based or at the school. And it was only supported for those school devices. That's kind of the interesting thing here. They weren't able to use their phones to connect to social media and things like that, unless it was a school-supported app. And so that's the SIPA compliance, which you see in the last line of that, the middle bullet point. A very secured network that could then also be used to support some other things if it was done correctly, things like security and locationing, et cetera. The net benefit ultimately that we were seeing, and we've heard this from many of the schools that we've worked with, is the kids are happier, right? They're able to get work done, they're learning more. And the ancillary benefit was driver retention rates actually went up in the schools that deployed this, which is kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? The kids are a little quieter. They're maybe a little bit more focused on getting work done, and maybe less rambunctious. And so it's an easier drive for the drivers themselves. So we saw a direct correlation to bus retention going up during this. Now, here's the thing. Even though E-rate may not support this moving forward, schools have been deploying buses and things on buses for a long time without the support of E-rate. And that continues just as it was before. So we will look for other funding mechanisms to continue to do this. And we'll talk about this a little bit further in the presentation, but really focusing on the security aspect to the bus as the reason for connecting a router to that bus. So, bus Wi-Fi was a portion of what we typically do when deploying a router on a bus, a very important portion, which was helping kids, but it's not the only reason we deploy. So let me hand it back to you, Kevin, so we can talk about some other aspects.
Yeah, sure, Ben. I mean, this is a perfect example of how the technology continues to become more sophisticated and evolve, as we go along. But maybe I can ask both of you guys, network modernization continues to be a priority for K-12 districts, right? I mean, and for the people who are running these districts, it's not one of these things now that, okay, we have our E-rate funding, we've got the pipes in the school, now we have the wireless going on. I mean, this is something that is each school year, something that is at the top of the to-do list, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jim, I'd love for you to, one of the neat perspectives that Jim has in his role dealing with, manufacturers and others and schools, of course, he's got a kind of unique perspective on what he's seen schools needing to do to modernize. So maybe Jim, if you can kind of use some of that unique perspective that you've got to talk about what you're seeing in the world of modernization.
Sure. Well, the bottom line is that we're looking right now at a Wi-Fi 7 world, and it still has some limitations on bandwidth. And what we're seeing as far as educational applications are going to consume that bandwidth. It's kind of a build it and they will come scenario. So we're seeing huge bandwidth applications in the AI. We're seeing things like holographic imaging. So real world kinds of applications that are happening in the classroom are going to consume bandwidth that's already there. Wi-Fi 8 is on the horizon. I've seen projections that say commercial availability for Wi-Fi 8 sometime in 2028. That's just around the corner in terms of technology infrastructure. So what does Wi-Fi 8 bring to the table? Well, Wi-Fi 8 obsoletes copper horizontal cabling to the classroom. So your standard access point today operates at a maximum of about 8 gig real world maximum. That's if everything's perfect. In reality, we see maybe 10 times that bandwidth coming out of Wi-Fi 8 into the classroom. That means that every classroom is going to need fiber cabling because there's no way copper is going to be able to provide that level of connectivity. So as these infrastructures start to change, we're going to see more and more of that. So your switches are going to have to change out to accommodate it, as well as your cabling infrastructure is going to change dramatically. So we're talking single mode fiber to the classroom, and we're talking fiber switches. That starts to lend itself to things like PONs, passive optical networks, et cetera, and different forms of delivery of power into the classroom as well. So these are all things that are on the horizon that are going to have impact on school district infrastructure. And so these school districts that are listening in on this should start to kind of theorize and plan on their budget cycles, because now they have a brand new 5-year budget cycle within the E-rate program for Category 2 infrastructure. That's my crystal ball of what's going to happen over the next 5 years.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting going back to the first school system I deployed Wi-Fi for back in '98 was in the first year of E-rate. We were doing 802.11b, and we were getting 1 to 3 megs of throughput, and we were quite happy with that at the time, right? So it's just a different perspective as what is truly needed. I would say now in our Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 7 deployments, we're using the capacity that's in those networks. It's not often overbuilt and underutilized. We're utilizing them. So one of the things that we do as Ericsson is we're really focusing on the wide area piece, right? The cellular side of things. And so most schools have a primary connection to that school, often paid for using E-rate dollars. That is untouched to continue moving forward. But you need a secondary link, right? That secondary connection to the school is very important because so many of the applications that we're doing, from the learning applications down to attendance, paying for school lunches with the cards that the kids get, that's all done usually on a cloud resource. We lose the WAN, we can't take attendance, we can't easily pay for lunches, we can't do most of the things that we need to do. We can't check kids in and out of school. So it's incredibly important that we have a very resilient WAN connecting that school. Traditionally, what we've been doing is a second fiber link to that school. Very normal. Unfortunately, it's very normal at the same time then that second fiber link is going across the same conduit at some point as their primary fiber link. Whether it's going through a second ISP or not, that is the norm. And so if we get one trenched, usually both are going down. And so the resiliency that we're thinking we're getting by adding a second carrier or just a second fiber link, we're not often getting. So we see that happen quite a bit with schools where both their primary and secondary links are down. So the great thing is now that 5G has really rolled out across most of the country, then what you're seeing is schools are now deploying that 5G connection as their secondary link instead of a second fiber link. And it's incredibly rare that you would lose both your fiber and your 5G at the same time. And the speeds of 5G are now really good. And the carriers have optimized these networks to be able to even give you a slice of that network to avoid things like heavy congestion that might make a cellular network in a traditional model not perform very well. Now we can guarantee performance in that 5G network using slicing. Even just a couple of years ago, we couldn't do that. So that's one of the bigger changes here from in modernization standpoint, is the resiliency that using 5G as your secondary connection can do. So it's really this kind of hybrid 5G and Wi-Fi model where you're doing both technologies at the same time to fit different roles and different needs. You're still going to probably inside of a school be going down to your devices for quite a long time using Wi-Fi and using then 5G to connect the school or maybe even your trailers or other things, which we'll talk about in a second, as a primary connection. So so that's some of the things we're doing in modernization, and then I think we can even talk a little bit more about that in a second, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you're talking about this combination of the Wi-Fi and the 5G, it's also enabling applications, as you mentioned in Berks County, that are going beyond just the classroom and the physical buildings, right? I mean, can you talk a little bit about the ability to expand beyond just what is the traditional classroom when it comes to these technologies?
Yeah, I think that's one of the really cool things about a router with both cellular and Wi-Fi inside of it, right? Now you're using the cellular piece to connect to the WAN and then Wi-Fi to extend down to the students. We see a lot in both modular classrooms. I learned a long time ago not to say a trailer, the modular classroom, and stadiums. Often, the stadium is a source of revenue for both the boosters, but as well as the school. And so having point of sales terminals set up over a Wi-Fi network that maybe pop up, out in an outdoor area versus only inside of the concession stand to be able to even sell products and food in the stands themselves using mobile terminals. With a Wi-Fi network supported by cellular, you can do that. We also see quite a bit of schools doing what we call like a gated network, where maybe you want to turn on a temporary Wi-Fi network for parents or visitors into a school. There's some schools that have church services inside of them on Sundays, for example, and their own network is actually kind of hard to get into because of the security requirements of the network. So to be able to set up a temporary network inside of that facility using a router and then more open Wi-Fi for non-school functions is something that we actually see quite a bit, and it's completely segmented, completely away from the school network, just using the cellular on the side. So those can be, whether we call them pop-up networks or let's say permanent guest networks outside of the school, is actually a very popular feature that we do see quite a bit. So it just, we're looking for ways to help fix connectivity issues. Ultimately, is what we're focused on as Ericsson.
Yeah, and Jim, does Ben's descriptions of that jibe with some of the experiences that you see in districts around the country?
Absolutely. And particularly the stadiums, even the sports booths, the announcers booths, where they need connectivity and much greater bandwidth than in the past. And it's very expensive to pull fiber, for instance, out to those facilities, or they may even be standalone facilities. You see a lot of those stadiums across the street from the school in Texas, as an example, where they're famous for that sort of thing. And then the whole idea of network optimization and the capabilities within the Ericsson solution set to deliver that is pretty slick. So,
yeah, and the final area that you can kind of see in the bottom left-hand side of the pictures, physical security, right? So a lot of schools are concerned about security, right? It makes sense. So we need cameras, we need access control devices at doors. There's all sorts of things that we want to make sure are connected, but that we struggle sometimes getting connection points to. In other words, I have a camera that I need to put out in the parking lot and monitor that maybe has some video analytics inside of it. So I'm looking for specific events at specific times of the day. Running, just like Jim said, running fiber out to a pole can be a really expensive task versus putting a router there. If I've already got power because it's a light, just getting a router deployed on that pole is actually quite easy to do if it's got cellular connectivity. And now I can connect a camera to that and bring it back to wherever I need to. And I can do that literally in one day versus waiting for my parking lot to get trenched up, which could take, 6 months to a year. So it allows the flexibility to bring any type of device, but right now there's a lot of focus on that physical security device, and so we frequently will do that. And again, outside of the school's core network, because sometimes we need that segmentation for different reasons, and that is a very common use. Not E-rate, right? This is not necessarily something that we're using E-rate to support. But that's okay. This is where the general budget comes in.
Yeah, but it sounds like in many districts, we're still looking at a combination of infrastructure, right? That it's not wireless only. Is that fair to say? And that it seems that there's a combination here that leads to some built-in redundancy and the ability to kind of keep things going if one or the other of those infrastructures has an issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's ultimately it's the resiliency of the network that we're trying to solve, whether it's for education purposes, teaching purposes, or school infrastructure purposes. Either way, resiliency is key. And ultimately, we're a connectivity company, right? We want to build the strongest connection for the need that exists at that time, whether it's for a mobile device or a fixed device. If you don't get a solid connection all the time, we're not helping the customer. And so that is our overall focus is connectivity.
Yeah, and Jim, from the point of view of applying for E-rate funds, are there any distinctions between wireless setups and fiber, or the combination of the two?
Well, that's where you come into on-campus versus off-campus. So the connectivity via wireless versus a fiber connection to your ISP is an example. Category 1 would pay for the fiber connection. This is a secondary connection. On campus, if that's a connectivity solution, then it's absolutely eligible under Category 2 internal connections, and away you go. So for instance, if you're doing a relocatable or temporary classroom solution while you're doing some construction or to house students, just because you have growth issues or whatever that might be, that connectivity with a device from Ericsson as a solution would be eligible under Category 2 internal connections.
Got it.
And we have seen actually it's not the primary way of connecting a school, usually 5G, or in the past LTE. But we did have a very large number of schools that were using Cradlepoint routers as primary where they couldn't get fiber. And that was a fairly common, it's getting less common now, thankfully, because I would rather have a fiber as my primary most of the time. But as the speeds of 5G have increased over time, there's a lot of comparability that's starting to play in those speeds, especially a smaller school that maybe doesn't need as much bandwidth as a much larger school. But if it's the primary link, it is E-rate eligible even in Category 1. It is just not it's not the most common. Typically you go fiber as your primary, and then but where you can't get the fiber, or you've got a temporary location, maybe you've had a natural disaster or something that's forced a relocation in a temporary way, we use cellular as the primary until we can get that new fiber run into that location. It's very common as well.
Well, that was certainly something. I'm sorry. I was going to say that during COVID, amongst many realizations, one of which is there are many districts and rural districts, and Jim, I think you mentioned Texas specifically, where running that fiber is just not cost effective for anyone, right? And so you need the wireless WAN applications, which
and frankly, E-rate, the USAC recognized this, the FCC recognized this a few years back, and actually permitted point-to-point wireless solutions as eligible for a wide area network connectivity, as well as where you can't get fiber as a primary connection.
Interesting.
Yeah, and speaking of WAN connections in general, you could actually look at slide 10, the next one. One of the things that we are seeing a lot now is as we build out more and more resilient WANs, and as we talked about earlier, the WAN is becoming extremely important to everything we do inside of the school, with everything being cloud-based now. You've got to have not just a resilient WAN from having a primary and a secondary, but you really need to start thinking about how can you use both of those connections, sometimes even more than two connections, in the way that each connection is really best, right? So some WAN connections are going to have a lot more capacity, multi-gig capacity. Others are going to have better latency speeds, for example, latency and jitter. So depending upon what we're doing, you might want to take advantage of each link differently depending upon that app that you're running inside of the school. And so that's where SD-WAN really starts to come into this as well. So SD-WAN networks not only combine those links into a big fat pipe, but are also really drilling down into the application and choosing the best link at the given period of time. Maybe you've got network congestion in one of those, and so I start taking my more critical apps and putting them on my secondary link because it's running better than my primary link. The brains of that SD-WAN network are really what starts to determine that. And what's interesting here is SD-WAN is really optimized by link type, but there's not a lot of companies that have taken the time to build their SD-WAN network understanding the difference in 5G. All right, 5G networks are different from fiber networks in the WAN. You have a much different profile from latency and jitter, for example. And sometimes they're a far more resilient network than a traditional LAN wired WAN network can be. So it's just, you really need the intelligence inside of that network to understand link type, and then how does that affect different applications. And so that is one of the things that we've been focused on as a company is not just building a router, but then building the intelligence behind the router with SD-WAN. And even though most schools probably wouldn't use 5G as their primary, they might want to take a look at an SD-WAN network that understands both of those elements, a wired and a wireless network. So that operational efficiency, which you see on the slide, is really incredibly important as we become extremely dependent on the apps. And what's interesting, one of the things that we're really looking at as an industry in the wireless sector is, we talk about 4G moving to 5G where we are now, and then moving eventually to 6G. Inside of each one of these Gs that we talk about right now, we're in 5G, there's changes that kind of constantly happen inside of them, which in like the Wi-Fi world, we would have an evolution change from Wi-Fi 6 to Wi-Fi 7. We don't really do that as much inside of the cellular world, although those changes are actually happening. So inside of 5G, there's been multiple rounds of evolution inside of 5G itself. The 5G that we're doing today is very different from the 5G that we really started rolling out just 3 to 5 years ago. Back then we were just talking about a download speed. Now we're talking about increases in both download speed and upload speed. We're talking about segmentation of the network and actually doing that today. Not just talking about it, we're actually doing it now, where we're carving off some of that spectrum just for that individual customer and guaranteeing the performance in that. And so, like I said, if there's an event that happens in that area and all of a sudden everybody picks up their phone to try to call, that bandwidth will actually be there for that customer in 5G. We couldn't do that 4 years ago. So that's really important as we build networks and promise to our customers that if you're doing this for a specific critical need, this network is going to be there for you. And then, like I said, with SD-WAN, being able to understand the network, specifically a 5G network, to build the most resilient network that you can is really, really important. So the great thing in the world of SD-WAN is that there is an E-rate eligible path for this. And that's something that we haven't done a lot of communication about as Ericsson. And so, Jim, I would love it if you could just talk for a little bit about SD-WAN specifically in E-rate, and what can you do, what can't you do, and how can we help our customers?
Flat out, E-rate supports SD-WAN through internal connections or the Category 2. So it will hit your Category 2 budget, but that's the worst case. That's the worst news of the whole discussion. SD-WAN is 100% eligible under internal connections. So you can acquire it, and E-rate will support it. Easy discussion.
I think that's, we have a lot of our partners and our customers who sometimes struggle between things like what's Category 1, what's Category 2, and this is one of those kind of interesting ones where it feels like it's both, right? Because you're paying or getting your primary WAN connection paid for in Category 1, but yet the router in this case is coming out of Category 2, and so it's a little, it's confusing. And so, yeah, it's great to know. I think you mentioned the budget though, right? That's a little different. Category 1, the people that were doing bus Wi-Fi, they didn't really have to worry about the cycle, right? It was just every year you put in. Can you explain that a little bit? The Category 2 cycle and budget.
Sure. So back in 2020, E-rate came up because of the overutilization of what was called internal connections or Category 2. It was oversubscribed. And so they decided to assign a Category 2 budget. And I like to say every student in America has a $201.57 bounty on them. That's the E-rate support over 5 years pre-discount. So if you have 1,000 student network, basically you have a $201,000 or $202,000 Category 2 budget available to you to spend. That's again pre-discount. So based on your demographics, whatever discount that is, up to 85% in Category 2, 90% in Category 1. The E-rate will pay for it, supporting that. So if you're in the 85% for Category 2, then you would have to come out of pocket 15 cents on the dollar to support that acquisition. That budget cycle is a 5-year budget cycle. So we just reset the budget. It's a use it or lose it over that 5-year term. So we're starting in 2026 funding year, which is the funding application cycle that we're now in. And that will start July 1, 2026 and move through June 30th, 2030 was the kind of the window that you have to spend that Category 2 budget.
It's great, great stuff. Maybe Jim, you could talk a little bit to anything more about the E-rate application process in itself. Any particular insights or steps that the audience may be able to kind of take from you as they go through that process?
So, Kevin, let me start off by saying I am not your E-rate consultant, and this is in no way, shape, or form me trying to assist you in your application process as an applicant. I know the rules of the road. I used to be an applicant consultant, so I'm very familiar, and I just want to make sure that I'm not trying to supplant your E-rate consultants in this conversation. And caveat this with I'm the consultant to Ericsson, and so therefore take everything I say with a grain of salt. That being said, so we are now in what I consider to be the application orientation cycle, the needs assessment to the typical end user environment where you have to figure out how much money do I have to spend and how am I going to spend it. This budget cycle creates a whole different kind of scenario that says, what does my 5-year life cycle plan look like? What is going out end of life and those kinds of things? And when do I need to account for that in my budget cycle over the next 5 years? So that needs assessment process this year occurs. And then applicants would typically file their Form 470. That's kind of the starting point for the initial application process for E-rate. That opening window occurs between July 1st, so we passed it, through the middle to end of February. And the reason it's the middle to end of February every Form 470 has to be available for open bidding on the street for 28 days. So if you need an RFP associated with that and getting all your ducks in a row and all the information together in one nice, neat package, you would issue your Form 470 as well as that RFP simultaneously. And then that starts the 28-day clock ticking. During that 28 days, the service providers, manufacturers will all put their heads together and come up with a proposal for you. That proposal gets submitted, and then during that cycle, your free and reduced lunch folks, the school lunch program folks inside your district will come up with the student data demographics and submit that into the E-rate program. And then they will conduct, whoever's managing the acquisition process for that Form 470 would engage in a fair, open, and competitive bidding process. It's not low qualified bid, it's best value, using price as the most heavily weighted factor in the evaluation. They'd select a service provider manufacturer partner and then execute an agreement and file the next stage, which is called the Form 471. Deadline for that Form 471 is typically end of March. So you work backwards 28 days. That's why I said deadline end of February. We don't know what those exact dates are, but typically that 471 window opens sometime in early to mid-January and extends through for 70 days till the end of March. Then now starts the review process. You've submitted your Form 471 that says, hi, I'm District XYZ. I want to buy the following goods and services. Here's the application. Here's my demographics. Here's what bill of materials and contract I've executed. Here's how much money I'm looking for. That goes into the review process. It's called Program Integrity Assurance, or PIA. At the end of that review process, which is excruciatingly detailed, they will come up with what's called a funding commitment decision letter. That's the FCDL. And then typical at that point, then you would begin the purchase order. There's a Form 486. It's a 2-minute form to fill out that says we're receiving these services now. Please go ahead and release the funds for them. And then installations and services begin, and then the invoicing process goes from there.
Oh, so that's it.
That's it. Piece of cake. It's I like to say it's not for the faint of heart. It's unfortunately, and I will say that if you have questions on this, there's an extensive amount of online support for this stuff. There's a ton of people out there. 65% of all these applications are assisted by some sort of a consultant. Again, it's not for the faint of heart. Compliance is key, and understanding the program so you don't make mistakes, and keeping you from making those mistakes is not necessarily a bad thing. So,
yeah. Well, so I mean, great, great information, and we really got into the weeds there, which I think for our audience is hugely important. But let's bring it back a little bit, big picture, as I put on my my perceived administrator hat, and talk a little bit about in the back of their heads when they talk about whether it's E-rate or not E-rate, but the implementation of a network or adding technologies, especially if we're talking about systems like this that are not only sophisticated but expensive. They're always seem to be judged by at the end of the day, learning gains, right? I mean, the pressure that they get from school boards and their parents, realistically is like, well, all this stuff lead to benefits on teaching and learning. And maybe you both, and just in your experiences and working with districts, have some examples where leveraging 5G technology has improved student learning and connectivity and beyond the classroom. I mean, Jim, I'll put you in the hot seat first.
It's a given that the more bandwidth and more capabilities that you deliver via technology into the classroom and to the student will improve student testing and to the student scores, just pure and simple. And we also know that lack thereof, teachers are reticent to give homework to students that don't have the capabilities at home. So that digital divide is a real thing. And so it just doesn't just dumb down the students that don't have the access at home. It dumbs down the entire student population of that particular demographic or that particular school. So bottom line is, it's vitally important that we cross that digital divide or the homework gap, whatever you want to call it. And it's to our benefit as citizens to do that, just pure and simple. Beyond that, there's numerous studies out there regarding student achievement, given the access to the technology that we're talking about. And the better the technology, the greater the student achievement. And there's big controversies about AI as what it can do and how it maybe dumbs us down to some extent. And in my experience, having been at this for a long time, so far it's fascinating, and I'm learning and consuming more than I ever have before because I've given the freedom to do so. If you're lazy, you're going to be lazy no matter what. But if you're really in tune with what's going on around you and you're looking to grow and expand and be successful, then you have to have these tools at your disposal.
Yeah, and if I could jump in on that, I mean, ultimately, connectivity is, like I said, that's what we're striving to fix. Wherever that connectivity need is, obviously we need strong connectivity in the school itself, where the kids are primarily learning, but the learning process doesn't stop there. And so, Ericsson builds very strong cellular core networks for all the major carriers in the US and around. That's kind of that's what we do, right? And so the idea that we're trying to get connectivity down to wherever that student might be needing the resources at that particular time, whether we're using E-rate funds or some other funding mechanism to get a device in their hands that can connect to a network. Personally, I don't really care what the network is, as long as they can connect to it and get the resources that they need. A cellular network is great for a lot of things. It's high speed now, and 20 years ago we didn't have this, right? 20 years ago when we were building networks at schools, it had to be Wi-Fi because that was all we had. Now there's some options, right? So I think that the long-term evolution of the program, as take current political things off the discussion board, if you just kind of look out in the future, what do we see changing in this world? And this is maybe a 20-year viewpoint, right? Cellular data rates will only get faster. And the difference between cellular data and Wi-Fi, as far as capacity and speeds, that there was a huge delta between those two 20 years ago. Basically, there was no cellular data. It shrinks every year, right? And is there really a time period in the future where we don't have two different networks? These merge into one. I can absolutely see that in the future. And so if I don't think I will be doing my job in 30 years from now, like I was 30 years ago. But if I were, I would absolutely see a path to where these networks converge, and we now have the ability to have a device that a student uses with one radio connection while they're in class, one radio connection when they're at home, and or at their baseball game or whatever it might be, where they've got a little extra time and need to use it to study. And that's a great thing, right? This converging of networks in the future to where connectivity doesn't have to be only available in one place, right? It's available wherever you are, whenever you need it. That's a good future to get to, and we're working towards that, which is exciting.
Yeah, and it seems too that when you talk about the last 20 years and innovations that come up in ed tech, whether it be AI that Jim you mentioned, but also things like virtual reality, augmented reality, esports. Yep. All those sort of things were
robotics.
But these were all great, but they were restricted by bandwidth, right? And then the use of wireless and plain old Wi-Fi. But it seems to me that the technologies, the 5Gs, the SD-WANs, all the various flavors of wireless that are now able to be put in place are a platform for those bandwidth heavy applications to actually succeed now, right?
Very much
Absolutely.
so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess one other question I have from the point of view of some of our audience here is, which is always at the top of the list of concerns, is security and regulation compliance. How do these modern connectivity supports secure and reliable internet access for these mobile learning environments, such as the school buses, Ben? I mean, when you talk about security, it has to be as secure as the fiber, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about 5G in general is from a network security standpoint, 5G networks are extremely secure. What we've always had in cellular infrastructure is actually a pretty significantly more secure overall technology than inside of base Wi-Fi. And that's coming from a guy who spent most of his career in the Wi-Fi world. So right off the bat, you're dealing with a superior security infrastructure. But we are still mostly going down to the student via Wi-Fi. So we still have to make sure that the features of Wi-Fi are utilized and turned on. And any Wi-Fi network that you buy, whether it's in a school, an enterprise, or at your home, if you don't use the security features, they're not very good. So you do have to turn them on, which most schools do. That's not an issue. And then there's the filtering aspect, right? We need to have a level of network filtering that meets the requirements. Usually we're having to do SIPA filtering. Our products have that capability inside of them as well. So it's a feature set that we do support. And we can go beyond that with application filtering beyond just the base web filtering sides of things. So we can control which applications on devices are being allowed across that network and which aren't. And you see different needs for that, and not everybody's unified on application control, and that's okay, right? To have differing opinions. But for example, if I'm putting bus connectivity on your activity buses, that's very, very normal. Maybe we don't do the whole fleet, but we do them for the fleet that's taking kids to sporting events, et cetera, and those are usually long rides. Maybe I know that these kids are going to be on them after a long game, and it's 8 o'clock at night. So I still have web filtering enabled, but maybe I do let them get to Instagram or whatever other social media app is common. And so those are things that each district can decide on their own, and you can use the tools that we've got to make that decision and easily enable them inside of the network, which is nice.
Yeah, Jim, any thoughts on security and regulation compliances? I'm sure that's part of what you need when part of your application for E-rate, right?
So you have to comply with SIPA to provide these networks through the E-rate program. So any funding that occurs comes along with it with a SIPA compliant statement that you will provide, as well as an ethical use statement saying that you will provide education to the users of your network in proper use of that network. And then the other comment is we're just wrapping up the initial stages of the cybersecurity pilot program. The FCC has recognized that there are significant vulnerabilities for schools and libraries and embarked on a $200 million cybersecurity pilot. It only incorporates 700 of a total of 24,000 applicants within the E-rate program. It's a multi-year pilot program. We're going to see what the results of that are, and then we anticipate that will expand the availability of security, cybersecurity funding through the E-rate program in the near future.
Yeah. Great. Well, we're approaching the top of the hour, and as I mentioned before we started, I knew the toughest thing would be to end this conversation. Each of just the last 5 minutes could be its own webinar in itself. So, first, thank you guys. But maybe just to wrap things up, I'll ask each of you to kind of give me a horizon thought as you see again the ups and downs of E-rate and politics and funding continue apace. It's never a dull moment when it comes to that, and the implementation of these technologies as they continue to improve. But maybe I ask you each to just kind of give us a where you hope to see things, say in the next few years, all things being equal. And maybe Ben, I'll put you on the hot seat first.
Sure. Yeah, that is a loaded question. Now
Hmm.
I'm cautiously optimistic, right? That we will continue to find new and exciting ways to help students learn more, and that's ultimately the main goal, right? So the technology sector as a whole isn't slowing down. Right, we're always enhancing these networks, whether it's moving to Wi-Fi 8 and 5G and 6G in the future. We're not going to stop innovating, and the guys, the companies that are making the apps for students are going to continue to improve, and things like VR and using that to do things that we can't even really comprehend right now. And AI is driving some of those application changes as well. It's exciting. We're going to need more bandwidth. I know that. And we'll need more capacity in the networks, and companies like Ericsson will continue to innovate and drive, which is fun. I mean, it's fun to be in the technology sector because it's always changing and always improving. So we're not going to stop, and we'll continue doing that.
Great stuff. And Jim, we'll leave you with the last word.
I tend to be a bit more pragmatic. Year one of a funding year, 5-year funding cycle, blocking and tackling. I would say if I were in anybody's shoes that has anything to do with IT and business for a school district, that I would certainly be looking at my Category 2 budgets and how I'm going to spend it wisely over the next 5 years. Managed internal broadband services or MIB support for monitoring is certainly beneficial, especially for smaller districts where they need that support for monitoring or management and operation of their networks. What's called MIBS, Managed Internal Broadband Services, is something I would certainly look at. Beyond that, let's vote.
Well, great stuff. And once
I
again,
I won't get any deeper than that, but I'm just going to say your vote matters.
yeah, that's a whole other webinar.
Yeah. That's more than just a webinar, I'm afraid.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank both Ben and Jim today for a very informative presentation and really a lot of great insights that I know the audience will take away. And I'd like to thank the audience members as well for joining us. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. So thanks again for participating, and have a great day.